Golda Meir was born May 3rd, 1898. She was married to Morris Meyerson from 1917 until 1951 when he died. She had two children named Menachem Meyerson and Sarah Meyerson. She was born in Kiev, which was, at the time, part of the Russian Empire. She then moved to Milwaukee, where she attended North Division High School and then Milwaukee Normal School. She was an outspoken proponent of a Zionist independent state during World War II and was one of the founders of Israel, signing their form of the Declaration of Independence. Meir worked for the Israeli public for a large portion of her life. After signing what was essentially the equivalent of the Declaration of Independence for Israel, she essentially created the Israeli Labor Party. She then served as a Minister of Labor for Israel and became Prime Minister after the death of then Minister Levi Eshkol and went on to serve about another 4 years. Meir's time as the Israeli Prime Minister wasn't so much focused on policy. There was a lot of conflict going on with other states around Israel. At the time, Israel at that point had only been its own state for about 20 years, and a lot of the states around it had part of their territory taken to make Israel a state, so there was still a lot of tension. Meir inherited essentially a war with Egypt. She was very peace-oriented. She tried to negotiate peace before resorting to any kind of violence. And eventually, in August 1970, she began her time as Prime Minister in 1969. There was a ceasefire with Egypt. However, that ceasefire would not even last Meir's entire term as Prime Minister. In October of 1973, Egypt launched an attack on Israel on the day of Yom Kippur, which is why it later became known as the Yom Kippur War, to try and win back some of their land. They lost in the Third Arab-Israeli War back in 1967. Even with the ceasefire with Egypt from August 1970 to the Yom Kippur or October War of 1973, there were other problems Egypt had to face. During that time, there was a growing movement for a Palestinian independent state, and there were multiple organizations that were essentially launching attacks. In September of 1972, 11 of Israel's Olympic athletes were murdered. There was the Lod airport attack, which was an airport near Tel Aviv, and there were multiple airplane hijackings during this time period separate of that attack. So she had a lot to deal with apart from just Egypt. It was really the entire area that was against Israel's existence, in a sense. That being said, there were some wins for Israel in this general time period. There was the Economic Development and Refugee Rehabilitation Trust, which spent millions of dollars on infrastructure projects in camps and provided loans and subsidies for agriculture and housing. As a result, agricultural production more than doubled between 1968 and 1972. Per capita income in the West Bank area increased by 80%, and unemployment in Gaza was reduced to 2%. Meir did have obviously some of her own ideas and policies. She introduced the National Insurance Act and other social legislation, and had a lot of responsibility for the housing and infrastructure projects that Israel used to cope with the immigration waves that followed their independence. She was a supporter of wage increases for the lowest income earners and for the middle classes, to exercise restraint so that those increases would be possible. On a global scale, Israel did not have a very high standing. Under Meir, a lot of states did not recognize their independence. Not a lot of states would trade with them, some because they didn't recognize their independence, others because they were scared of having an embargo put on them by oil trading countries that didn't recognize Israel's independence. But they did have a relationship, not necessarily a close one, with the United States, which at the time of Meir's time as prime minister was led by President Nixon. The US did give Israel economic aid as part of the relationship, and they did help them negotiate the first ceasefire with Egypt. However, around the time of Egypt's plot to launch their attack on Israel in what became the Yom Kippur War, the US was in the middle of the Watergate scandal, so not a lot of aid was given to Israel, and what aid was eventually given, which did help them a lot in fighting Egypt off, was eventually withdrawn under threats of oil producing countries to stop trading oil with the US. All in all, though, Meir was a very competent, peaceful leader. She had a representative, rational, legal approach to leading. The Prime Minister of Israel did not have term limits, does not have term limits, but their power is very much checked by the government. They have to really work hand in hand with the government to get things accomplished. Her perspective was kind of socialistic, not completely, but kind of a mix of liberal and socialist. And she is and was thought very highly of as a leader. She was Israel's first female prime minister, the third female prime minister in the world, and she still has a lot of influence and impact today.